Hello, welcome. This is Corey Angelot with the End of Slavery Summit here with Aaron Butler, my co host, and we're here with a very special guest, David Greenberg. David is a performance artist, video editor, and producer, abolitionist, anarchist, and de occultist. He has many great videos, and I really like his aesthetic because I really like the way you incorporate art with all your stuff. I mean, you can see from your videos to your website, everything is artistic and very professional, and I really admire that in your works, and I think a lot of people like myself can take inspiration from it. Your website is freedomvibe.art. So freedomvibe.art. Freedom Vibe is also on other platforms, right? You're on YouTube and other platforms where
Yeah.
you share a lot of video messages, and you even have articles, and you're willing to share other people's videos if they're interested as well. So thank you for that. And we're going to be talking about a really important topic here with David: how unresolved trauma generates slavery. So let's get started with this. If you want to introduce a little bit more about yourself and why this is really important for the cause.
Thank you, Corey and Aaron. First of all, I want to say thank you for allowing me to participate in this summit. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to contribute here. And yeah, so I've been an active participant in doing the great work of ending human suffering and ending slavery, including teaching as much as I can, sharing knowledge, obviously learning and growing. I've been doing that for just over a year now, uh, to the greatest degree that I can. And like you pointed out, I've decided to pretty much take an artistic approach, created my own unique style because I really took to heart what Mark Passio and others said about doing the work, but not just becoming another copy of them, bringing my own aesthetic to it. So that's why I've made such an effort to create a unique presentation. And I think when we share the same knowledge in many different ways, it also helps to reach a greater audience because people are going to learn in different ways and people are going to respond in different ways to different aesthetics and different presentations. So that's a main reason why I've done it that way. And it just makes it more enjoyable too in the process. So it's really great to be here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, and so you got slides that you provided for the audience, which will be really cool. We can dive deep into. The first slide says how unresolved trauma generates slavery. So, how do we get started with this, understanding this? And like I said, why is it important for people to look at trauma in the first place, right? I mean, is this a place where we start? Do we all have traumas inside ourselves? How do we find it?
Great questions, Corey. One of the things I've learned from diving into occult knowledge and just becoming a student of natural law and these principles is we really need to always make an effort to understand root causal factors of why things are the way they are, if if we actually want to change them, right? So um, I definitely want to change things. I wanted to change things in my own life and then projecting it out into the greater reality. I wanted to have the opportunity to help change the world and live in a better world, a better, a world of more freedom. So I knew that the only way to do that was to actually understand root causal factors. And fortunately, we also often find that things are often much simpler than we think they are if we're being honest and we're really taking a good look. So one of the while this may not be the only causal factor, one of the main causal factors that I have learned and discovered that is generating the slavery and the suffering, the chaotic human condition that we have right now, is because you and I, all of us, and a large amount of people in the world, probably the vast majority, we have these unresolved traumas.
Mm.
And in this presentation, I'm going to talk about how I piece together how that unresolved trauma actually literally generates a reality that is based on slavery.
Wow. Yeah, so let's jump right into the first slide here, where you basically define trauma.
Yep. So we need to. One of the things you guys, Corey, I know you've watched some of my videos. People who watch my content will know that I try to always define terms, to avoid confusion, to always be very clear. So trauma, just so we're talking about the same thing, trauma is any kind of sudden or severe physical and or psychological harm that is overwhelming to the being. It really takes them almost or even beyond their current capacity to protect and defend themselves. And the word overwhelm is perfect for that. So it's usually sudden. It doesn't always have to be sudden. It can be continuous. It could be one time. So it comes in different forms. But this is basically what trauma is. And as we're going to see as we move forward, we all experience trauma to some degree or another.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I mentioned before. I'm like, is it something that we share? I mean, we see that, natural law is this force that is throughout all of the world, right? And everybody has this law within the universe that we have to understand. Not that everybody does understand it, or that everybody uses it to their benefit, but we all commonly share certain things, and those things we don't always understand. So this is another aspect that I think plays a huge role for sure. So now let's look at slavery, right?
Yep. So, of course, this whole conference is focusing on slavery and how to end it. So, it's important that we all understand what the actual definition of slavery is. And again, it's very simple. Slavery is a state of, or a condition, or a set of conditions where one group claims to be the owner of another group. They own their life, they own their rights, their property, uh, and they use violence because it's unnatural, as we'll see. They use violence to basically maintain that control and that ownership of the other group.
Yeah, and there's different forms of it, right? There's chattel slavery in the 1800s,
Right.
and now, and the abolitionists also warned us of different forms, like Lysander Spooner said, hey, there's such a thing as political slavery, economic slavery, and a lot of
Yep.
people were touching on that after the abolitionist time, after the 1800s, and it's still a topic to this day where there is still chattel slavery in different places of the world. But there's other forms, and I think, when we look at trauma, and we relate that to slavery, I mean, there's a great relationship. I mean, if you're physically enslaved, you're probably under a lot of trauma, I would imagine, right? So, let's kind of go deeper into this. You said slavery doesn't occur naturally; it must be generated through programmed behavior. So, what
Yeah.
does
This
that
is
mean?
this is a yeah. This is a very important point to understand. Um, Slavery is not a naturally occurring phenomenon because it doesn't align with, it's not in harmony with any of the natural laws, any natural law or any of the principles of harmony of the universe. It has to be a construct. It has to be a mental construct, and it has to be generated somehow to actually manifest. So the way that it manifests, again, this may not be the only way, but one of the main ways is through programmed behavior, right? Because again, anything that's going to manifest in physical reality comes through behavior. That's how we actually create reality, through our behaviors. They started in the mind, they started in the mental plane, and through the emotions, but they ended up as some kind of physical behavior. So the only way we can actually experience slavery is if behaviors that you and I and others, humanity as a whole, we can say, or a large population is affecting, is actually generating that. And these behaviors need to be very specific because they are creating that unnatural condition.
Hmm. Okay. So, is trauma one of those behaviors that triggers other behaviors, or is it the starting point?
It's the starting point. As we're going to see as we move forward in this presentation, that the trauma is kind of the precursor. It's the
Okay.
foundational state that then leads the beings to generate the
Hmm.
behaviors that are needed, these programmed behaviors that are required in order to manifest slavery and to keep it going
Would you
in all of its
say
different forms.
would you say fear has to do with trauma?
Fear, or an ongoing state of fear, um, yes, an ongoing state of fear of a certain condition can lead someone to modify their behavior, and that can actually lead to the kind of behaviors that will generate slavery.
Hmm. So yeah, you said
100%.
trauma provides the perfect vehicle to program specific behaviors. Now, why is it the perfect vehicle?
Yeah, and I should have probably said unresolved trauma, because if a trauma happens and we are somehow able to overcome it, and this is what I'll talk about later in the presentation, is how to overcome these traumas. But if the trauma is unresolved, if it's unhealed, then the coping mechanism which the body, which the being put into place to protect themselves from further trauma, from further harm, that is going to reduce down and limit their behavior. So when you're afraid of a condition reoccurring, when you're afraid of something that happened and you don't want it to happen again, or you're always on the defense against it, you may deem yourself needing to modify behaviors, and those are behaviors that can be directed or programmed because because of the way our psychology works. It's all based on psychology, right? So
Right.
unresolved trauma, I should have said, provides, when it happens in a very large scope, meaning across a large number of people, it does provide the perfect fertile ground to program those behaviors that are going to lead to slavery and create continuity of slavery.
Yeah. Would you say because it has to do perhaps with the lack of self-control? Because you mentioned that slavery is the claim of control of somebody else controlling another person. So if that person who's being controlled doesn't have self-control, they kind of give away their themselves. They're more vulnerable per se. Would you agree
Yeah,
with that?
out of the fear mental state, we're much more likely to give up control for the sense of security, especially if someone comes along and offers a solution or says, "Here's how I can protect you." So we're much, and also as we'll see, it's going to start to shut down some of the higher mental faculties that would otherwise filter out, people who come and make these hefty promises and they aren't really based on actuality. So
Yeah.
because it's scoping down the mind, I'm going to talk about that in one of the upcoming slides, how it impacts the performance of the mind slash brain, so that it actually leads the person to be more susceptible to suggestion and more susceptible to giving up their power. And ultimately, it does require. I don't think I put a slide about this, but it's something I've heard, and it's very important. It does require the person to have a certain lack of self-respect and self-autonomy, like how they perceive their own selves and their ability to deal with these things. That is required also for them to even be able to give up control.
Hmm. So yeah, I think this is really important because a lot of people may experience trauma in one form or another, and we just need to deeper understand what it is, especially if we're claiming that, hey, this is something that is affecting everybody. This is the reason why, we're becoming enslaved. So let's look into that then, the methods of generating slavery.
Yeah, and this is something that is, again, these are well documented things. These are things that, once you start to study occult knowledge and natural law and what's going on in the world, it becomes more and more apparent what's happening. Now, not everybody is necessarily going to go through ritualistic child abuse. Not everyone as a child was actually raped or tortured. Many children are even murdered. Um, I'm not saying that everyone in the population goes through that to the extreme, but it happens enough. It's enough of a trend in the human population to have an impact, right? And it could also happen in many degrees. There could be child abuse that isn't necessarily entirely physical, it could even be just psychological, right? So this is a big part of it. But the other side of that is the withholding of knowledge and important information, that if children and adults had that information, had access to it, and were taught it from a very young age, would allow them to, even in the face of certain types of trauma, to have more tools and be able to overcome them more quickly, because they would have access to a deeper and a wider set of knowledge. So that's another part of it. Perpetuating trauma states. This is something I went through myself. This and endless psychology. When I was younger, I would go to the psychologist many times to try to deal with, some of the traumas that I had experienced. And what I found looking back is they would often just repeat everything on a loop. It was literally like we would just go and talk about the same things over and over again, and there was no resolution. There was no aha moment. There was no, hey, I know that David, I know you went through this, but here's what you really need to do to finally heal this and move forward. That was never offered. So even even a lot of the psychologists, they are perpetuating it by not providing a solution, and instead just over and over again repeating the trauma. In essence, keep repeating it, keep amplifying it, and then basically giving it more power.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead, Corey.
Well, no, you may even be able to say like that's like a slavery too, like you said, like because you are dependent on the psychologist for that help and you just can't find any other answers. And you really don't know, and you'd hope that they study all this time and they know the solutions for you, but then they also may give you a drug and you might become dependent on that drug. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden now you're a slave to another thing. I mean, it's a little dangerous, I would say.
Yeah, and I went through that personally. I probably haven't talked a lot about it on my videos, and I'll probably share some more. But I was on pharmaceuticals and psychiatric medication for many years, for more than 10 years. I went to psychologists, I went to psychologists. And yeah, when you go as a young child or even a young adult, my perspective was I expected these people to be on my side. I expected them to be, the ones who actually can help. And it took some time for me to see that, but eventually I saw they're not here to help. In many cases, whether they're intentionally doing it because they're actively, you know, they're actively acting out this agenda consciously, or whether they themselves have been programmed through their own traumas and they just kind of repeating it. It could be either or, but the net result, of course, is the behaviors that they play out and then what they pass on to their quote unquote patients. So
Right.
that is a very big part of it. Um, but there's also physical traumas. Today's physical traumas are these vaccines, pharmaceuticals, as you mentioned, Corey, have been a long-standing physical trauma and assault on the body, which is occulted and kind of couched as though it were the opposite of, as though it were actually supposed to help us. Different types of medical trauma that happen. So physical trauma, not just in the home, the child abuse dimension, but also in other types of physical trauma also are having a part because these are traumatic to the body, and the body knows the intelligence of the body is going to know it's being assaulted, even if there's cognitive dissonance, even if the mind is not able to grasp that. So these are also having um, an effect. And then the perpetuating trauma states through identity, that was kind of reference to these cultural memes where people become very identified with their sexual preference, with their gender identity, with other aspects of themselves, even their race, and so forth. And it becomes so strong, and it's almost always associated with victimhood, right? Because it's this thinking that I'm always a victim, I'm constantly a victim, I'm going to be a victim, I could be a victim. It's this disempowering mindset that is also required to keep encouraging people and actually um, generating the kind of behaviors, the kind of limited program behaviors that will perpetuate this whole state of slavery.
Right. Right. And that's why I say to people, some people don't produce content and they're,
Yeah.
online and they're not doing necessarily the work that we're doing, but they don't have to do it the way we're doing. Like you said in the very beginning, they can have their own way. And just because they're not doing it does not make them any different from us. They don't have to look up to us. We're just sharing a message that we
Yeah.
think is really important. And you're right. I mean, we can form identities with anything and politics and all sorts of different things. And if we associate ourselves enough with it, it just becomes so part of us that we enslave ourselves or make it easier for us to be vulnerable to different things. And, it's like, oh, well, now we can create a division easier, right? The people who are controlling these parties can say, well, hey, now this person's on this side, this person's on that side. Let's put them against each other. It's easier because people are being divided and they're falling for that divide, right? They're falling into the traps, or they're putting themselves in their own traps and they're degrading themselves, like you said. It's like the slave on the plantation who says, I'm meant to be a slave. I mean, that's doesn't sound right.
It's all based on consent.
Mm.
Ultimately, it requires consent, even if the person is acting out of trauma. And I'm glad you used the word trap because I just watched David Icke's latest presentation called "The Trap." Actually, was what it was called, and he talks a lot about this. How the dark sorcerers, he doesn't call them this, but I often refer to them as dark sorcerers or ancient occult psychologists, the occult priest class, all these terms that we use. These people are actively, setting in motion the social engineering of the world and building these constructs. They know that if they can get the consciousness to reduce down and look at itself in a very limited form, then that serves the agenda of slavery, because an empowered being who knows that they are only subject to the laws of creation, who knows what their true potential is never going to buy into any of this. Even if they experience some kind of trauma, they're simply going to look and do the best of their ability to heal and not make an identity. So they know that this is this idea of creating an identity around some kind of, group think, some kind of victimhood, some kind of group that is supposedly oppressed, that is an excellent way to keep perpetuating traumas through someone's entire lifetime, in fact.
Hmm. Yeah, so you said unresolved traumas in the next slide here that continue to manifest as programmed protective behaviors generate an ongoing mental imbalance that expresses in consciousness as either a master or a slave in behavior.
Yeah, this is one of the main points of my presentation is that, again, unresolved traumas, because we're going to have traumas. It's just part of living. Living is dangerous. We're going to experience something at some point or another in our life, probably multiple times. So I'm in no way or form am I suggesting that we can live, that when we live free, there is no trauma. Of course, there's always going to be the potential for trauma, and it may or may not be less or more depending on the reality. But it's the unresolved traumas, they continue to play out, because what happens, and this is again what these masters of human psychology understand, is that if a trauma is unresolved, if it results in a certain behavior modification that is usually done to protect the being from further harm, or at least their perception of protecting themselves, if that's, the deeper they can get that to be embedded into their psychology, the more it's programmed, in the sense that they can count on it, it can be triggered, it can be activated over and over and over again, and anytime certain conditions show up, it'll just acting out. And it is those very behaviors that express in the mind, in the brain, they create a mental imbalance, right? And they create a mental imbalance that usually shunts control to one part of the brain or another, and the expression of consciousness through behaviors is going to be some kind of behavior which is either acting like a master, the ones who are trying to control others and inflict the violence, or acting like a slave, the one who is basically saying, yes, I have to obey what they say, I have to follow these orders, I have to stand in line, I'm afraid, I'm even afraid to basically to not do that. So this
Hmm.
is extremely important. This is kind of the main point of my thesis here.
Yeah, and I like the fact you use the word protective because I think that's a very powerful theme. It's this idea that the master is there to protect the slave, and the slave is
Yeah.
needs protection, by
Right.
the
That's how
master.
it's told. That's
Yeah,
how it's told. Yeah.
but if they're dependent on each other, then you got to be careful because now you have dependence, and where does that lead them? Is that's not self-sufficiency, that's not self-empowerment. So that's interesting. Very interesting topic. You said that we are all subject to trauma for our entire lives. It's how we overcome
Yeah.
and heal
This
from
is
trauma.
this is a fact of life in this 3D reality. We live in a physical reality. We can be injured, we could be harmed, we can be injured psychologically or harmed psychologically as well. It's just the nature of reality. We have free will, so that means some beings are going to act in harm even in a completely free world. It's just the nature. So it's not that, it's in no way am I suggesting some kind of utopian thinking that somehow we will never have trauma. That's ridiculous. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be able to learn and grow. It's not the fact that we will, or whether we will or will not experience traumas. It's perhaps more so how we learn to overcome and heal and integrate those traumas and learn from them and move forward despite them. That is really what makes all the difference in the world.
Right. And we don't want it taking over our lives either, right? I mean, we see how the world's events can be taking people's mindsets over, and everybody's always thinking
Yep.
about it, and it's in politics, and what's going on is keeps getting into people's lives, and they don't want it in their lives, right? Some people do want it in their lives. They have an open invitation, and then it hurts other people who don't want it in their
One
lives.
yeah, one thing that I really like is that it's a natural it's there's these types of traumas, and when a lot of people start doing the shadow work, you realize that there are very subtle forms of trauma that they can be overcome, and not a lot of these little minor traumas that maybe separation, your first time being separated from your parents, these things, granted you weren't abandoned, but these are just little traumas that happen over time and over, everyone has, like, I guess you would call it a natural trauma, um, you know to life, and it's super important to remember too that trauma, um, it's individualistic. Everyone has very similar traumas, and you know people are oftentimes traumatized through similar ways. But a lot of people, they spend their whole life trying to chase this specific, closing the whole trauma and fixing it forever. But there's a part of trauma where that's life, and it's part of the trauma that makes you you, and it's the lessons that you learn that you get
Yeah.
to share. And it's something that a lot of people will chase their whole lives trying to heal this, but in reality it could be their biggest superpower to help and make a difference with other people, and have that experience. And I like how you focus on the unresolved trauma, because um, I think it was Young. He said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll control your life, and you'll call it fate, or something to that
Yeah.
effect. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
and it's so powerful too, because when you take a look at yourself and you learn these more major, very traumatic experience that you have, and then you can reflect on it to the more subtle traumas that just come with existence. Then it helps put a lot of things into perspective, just as far as individuating yourself and separating yourself from the trauma.
Yeah, we can never change the past. Once something has happened, it's happened. It's how we bring consciousness to it to learn the lessons appropriately from the highest level of consciousness that we can. That's what really makes a difference. So healing traumas could be as simple as understanding why something happened, how it came to happen, and what we needed to learn from it. We're not going to be able to erase that memory, and that's not the goal of healing either. Is not to erase the memory, or as some people say, clear your karma. I think clear your karma is a new age bullshit term. I don't subscribe to that at all. But I think there is appropriate way to clear the effects of trauma,
Mm.
the integrate. I like the word integrate much more, because it's going to have to be, like you said, it's going to have to be, it is a part of us. Not that it has to be, it is already a part of us because it happened. If for no other reason, it's truth. It's based on truth. It actually happened. Now, what we can change, what is variable, is the free will choice to learn the lessons, to analyze with higher consciousness what happened, and to take the appropriate action accordingly, which could be preventative, but it also could be, based on principles. In fact, I would say it's almost certainly based on principles. So that's the real healing. Not that we can somehow erase it, or like as though it never happened. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I'm not sure if you meant it this way, but you mentioned the unresolved traumas that manifest as programmed protective behaviors. And at a certain sense, did you mean that as our minds and our consciousness actually does protect ourselves from this trauma, and it gives us a space, like I guess in the extreme example of the child abuse, or severe torture of children, when they're able to separate themselves and there's a split, it's a protective mechanism. And it seems like that's something that obviously our minds, there's it's able to separate and give us space from these things for a reason. I don't know if
Yeah.
that makes sense, but
Yeah, trauma. That's why trauma-based mind control is such a thing, and there's compartmentalization. And those again who know psychology at a deep level know and understand it, but they apply it in the negative. They apply it to cause harm. It's because they understand those mechanisms. And someone may have to go, through a healing process to actually remember what happened. I know that Jay Parker had to go through that to some degree. He remembered many things probably when he was well into his 40s, well in his life. There were many things that he had suppressed, as well as other uh, others who have suffered satanic ritual abuse, they may have had to literally unlock memories that were suppressed. Yes, there is an aspect of psychology, and that's of course on an extreme case when they're subject to extreme trauma, especially under the age of 5, starting even in infancy. That those things are going to be much more deeply embedded in the psychology. So yes, we will probably all, to some degree or another, will have to heal from those traumas. Many people, like myself, were circumcised. That's a traumatic event that we may not have even fully overcome. So there's a lot of different dimensions to this. But sure, in some specific cases, maybe even in many cases, the healing process may actually require them to determine how to unlock memories that have been repressed and suppressed.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, this is really interesting, very powerful, I would say. And I think making that distinction between resolved and unresolved trauma is very important, because in this next slide, you even say psychopaths inflict trauma on their victims in order to control their behaviors. So if that trauma is unresolved, then that psychopath has their way, right?
Yeah, so they know what they're doing. They have no sense of morale. They don't have a built-in moral compass. It's damaged, so they can only relate to others and to the degree that they can control them. And every psychopaths are all different. I didn't want to say that all psychopaths do this even to the same degree or at all, but the ones who do, they are very intentionally inflicting this trauma because they already know through their own dark study of occult knowledge, they already know that this is what happens. Like all this that we're talking about on this presentation, they already know that. They're simply using that knowledge in the negative. They're using it to inflict more trauma, to perpetuate trauma. They're using it to their advantage to generate the ongoing state of enslavement. So it's important that we face the truth, the fact that there are people in the world. We can call them psychopaths, we can call them dark occultists, we can call them whatever we want. But these people, they actually want to perpetuate the state, and so they are using that psychology in that for that specific purpose. So it's very important that we face that and we don't run away from that truth.
And I like the fact that you're willing to share your personal journey with us here, because I think that also gives a good example as to what we're trying to talk about.
Yeah, and I chose a photo from not too long ago, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, somewhere in that range. I think it was within the last 10 years for sure. And I mean, it's funny because these photos, some of them I still have up on my Facebook. And I went back looking for old photos and I looked at this photo of myself. I said, my God, you can see it. You can see it in my eyes. You can see it in my expression, how unhappy, how traumatized I am is the correct word. And I just wanted to mention again, I said earlier, we all have traumas. This may not even be all of them I've been through, but these are some that I remember very clearly and saw how they played out in my life. So when I was very young, one of the earliest memories I have is being taken to a psychiatrist. The ostensible reason was my parents thought I was acting strangely and they didn't understand it. Who knows if that's the actual reason? But I remember this guy, this psychiatrist, gave me a very bad feeling, even at a young age. And he was just treating me like a specimen and basically observing me and making comments to probably to me and but mostly to my parents, just basically saying that I would never be normal. That was the ultimate message. David will never be normal, right? Imagine if you're young parents and your first child, and that's what this psychiatrist or this quote unquote authority figure that you trust to give you right information, that's basically their diagnosis. Your son will never be normal. And never is a very powerful word because it leaves no possibility for healing and for change, right?
Yeah.
I was verbally abused and silenced as a child, even by my own mother. That's since been forgiven and integrated. But at that age, at younger age, preteen and early teens, that's what happened. I was bullied in school constantly and didn't stand up for myself. Even my own grandfather on my mother's side, one time I went to give him a gift, some flowers I had picked from the garden, and he broke out in the most violent rage that, like, you would only expect from someone if they found out that someone had actually murdered someone they know, or done something really, really damaging, not that they had just picked flowers. So completely out of proportion. So these kind of events, especially when you don't have the right kind of parental guidance, you don't have the right context, they can leave a real imprint. And in my particular case, these events, and probably others as well that I didn't mention, have definitely left an impression, and definitely because they were unresolved, they led me to behave in certain ways through a large part of my own life, right?
Yeah. Thank you for being willing to share that with us. I mean, because I certainly too have certain traumas that I don't think I've probably covered ever on my channel. You know what I mean? Because I don't like to talk about myself, frankly. You know, I like to usually talk about worldly things and what's happening. But I think we can use ourselves as sort of to say, like, this is the experience. This is how we came to be. This is why we think the way we think. And, you know, we had to go through some recoveries. Yeah, of course. Everybody has. I think, you know, we're not alone when we say that we have faced different things. And some people have experienced things that a lot of other people haven't experienced, but still, you're never alone, right? There's always other people who experience something similar, if not worse, than something that you already had or have had, right? So, just if that's a little motivation for people to, you know, have faith in healing themselves, I think it is. I mean, there's a lot of people who I know go through all sorts of things, and they go through it, and you know, I may think, oh well, I'm bad here and there, but it's like there's other people who went through worse and they got even better. You know, it's like, so who am I to complain? You know what I mean? But I am to complain. I need to embrace it. I need to look at it, and I need to confront it, like you said. So this is interesting. So you have an outcome out of this, right? Out of your traumas.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say, the principle of correspondence in Hermeticism explains well why this inner work, the shadow work, is so important. Because the outer world, the greater world, is always a reflection of the inner world. So when the inner world is in chaos and we're unhealed within, the world itself is the greater reality is gonna manifest collectively in a similar way. So this is why it's so important that we do that. One second, dame 5 minutos. Gracias. Um,
I didn't even know
so
you spoke another language.
yeah, Spanish. Yep.
That's cool.
So what happens is the traumas that I experienced, they gave me there was a desired outcome that they wanted to create. This is another photo of me at around 5, 6, 7 years ago, and kind of you can see in my facial expression the amount of suffering I was going through. So I pieced together that the outcome that they gave, that they want, that all these different elements. I'm not saying it was one person, but the collective outcome that they wanted to generate for me was, David, you don't really love yourself. You aren't worthy of love, right? And that is the underlying belief that then generates all the behaviors that come after it that allow one to actually be enslaved. So the manifested outcome from that belief system, or that psychology, is, for most of my life, up until fairly recently, to be honest, I was basically consenting to be a slave, to be the slave in that master slave paradigm. And that was basically the behaviors that I was acting out in the world to be that slave,
Mm,
right?
I see. Yeah, and I think that's where like self-loathing and self-respect come in, like we mentioned before, making sure that we take a good look at ourselves in the mirror, figuratively. But so the manifested outcome, you mentioned, for most of my life until recently, I consented to being a slave due to my behaviors. Yeah, and so then your next slide says, what specific traumas are you suffering from that may still need to be healed?
Right.
Right.
So this is me putting it back. So I've explained the concept in general. I talked about some examples from my own life. Now I want to kind of put it back to you, the audience, and I want you, again, if you really want to be free, and we're all here to be free, there's no escaping doing this work. So a good question for you to ask yourself at this point is, what are some of the specific traumas that you are and have been suffering from that haven't really been healed, that you've either been avoiding, that there are specific behavior patterns that you keep acting out. Maybe it's a repeated pattern. Maybe it's a social dynamic pattern with other people. Maybe it's a self-inflicted harm, which is also a dynamic. So I want to ask people. This is kind of the homework. Again, people
Okay.
may have to sit down, and I recommend people sit down and really do that shadow work. But really be honest with yourself and look for those traumas and those opportunities to heal. And you may not be able to figure it out all at once. That's fine. But as long as you're doing the work and piecing it together and uncovering and learning and growing every single day, day by day, that is the actual work to come to heal these traumas.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, it's something that we all need to confront with ourselves, especially if we're going to go out into the world, right? We need to fix ourselves first before we start pointing fingers or saying other people need to change. Yeah.
Exactly. We need to understand how the ego, as you guys mentioned earlier, is actually, I think Aaron talked about it, how, for example, causing you to not remember things. The ego, the self-identity, is going to and does respond to these traumas. And it's basically usually based on very low-level protective mechanisms, which could be blocking memories, as I mentioned here. It could be some hardwired, very low-level self-defense protective behaviors that are designed to protect both the thinking, I should say, that bypass higher order thinking. What I meant by that is it goes to the lower brains, especially the reptilian brain, the R complex, the fight or flight mechanism. It's literally bypassing. This is how the mind works in the brain. It's bypassing higher order thinking, which is more contemplative, more expansive, but the ego doesn't deem it appropriate in an emergency, so it has to bypass it for very quick action. So unfortunately, when that keeps repeating itself, you keep repeatedly bypassing these higher order thinking, and that's kind of where triggers come in, because the trigger just immediately brings you back down into that lower level consciousness of the lower brains. It also suppresses emotions, or it could be the opposite. It can make us too dependent on certain emotions, or ascribing too much importance to certain emotions that may be very closely correlated with the trauma. In other words, what actually happened. Um, and it also can craft a story. This is the identity part. We start to tell ourselves a story in order to make sense of the events when they're so dastardly or they're so traumatic that we, in any other context, like we're not willing to face the evil, so to speak. So we have to make up a story to to uh, to justify in our own minds how and why this could have happened, right? And it also tends to keep pushing that fight flight mechanism over and over again, which of course activates adrenaline, which is very tiring to the body, and it kind of keeps us in an exhausted state. So it's really important to understand that these, until you heal and really face the trauma with higher consciousness, all these things that are designed from a lower level perspective to protect us, they're just going to keep operating over and over again.
Right. And to sort of add on to the fight flight thing, since, I look at nutrition, I think it's a really important topic to look at. If people are going toward caffeine and sugar to help relieve their traumas, because that might happen where people feel like they have to eat certain foods because of certain feelings or certain things in their life, that too needs to be addressed, right? I might
Yeah.
call it cravings. And those cravings usually can come from deficiencies, can come from all sorts of things. Deficiencies within your own life, not even just mineral or nutrient deficiencies. Deficiencies within your relationships, exercise, career, spirituality. Right? These are all core essential things that everybody needs to have to some extent. I admit I haven't been exercising as much if I'm doing a lot more mental work, but then I realize, oh wait, I need to do more physical work. So I
Yeah.
create a balance for myself and I try to listen to see what I need. And same thing with my body. And it's interesting because you can add a bunch of sugar to chocolate and all of a sudden it becomes this unhealthy thing. But you get out the sugar and it becomes a pretty healthy thing. It makes you feel better. Chocolate has all
Yeah.
these mood chemicals that make you feel pretty good. And it stimulates the body a little bit different from caffeine, but it's just something to notice because people will go to these foods for certain reasons. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm lacking love in my life, so I choose chocolate. I wonder why. Perhaps because it's connected to the heart and makes you feel better. So just something to take note of. Fight or flight. Like when you increase your insulin because of carbohydrate consumption, those hormones like cortisol, your stress hormones, are going to be affected. So it might help to also make some dietary changes, but you have to experiment, not go necessarily on a diet or follow this or that program. Listen to your body and find out what is it you need. Same thing with this trauma, right? Like you said, you can't just follow one program or one physician. You got to really address it and look at the root cause, which is at an individual level, because everybody experiences trauma differently. So this is really important, and I think I like the fact that these future slides that we're going to be talking about is going into the mind, right, and how our brain works, because we haven't really had that perspective in this event, this summit with all these speakers. This is a really important concept, I feel like, that can help a lot of people.
Yeah, and the fact that you mentioned chocolate and sugars and sweets is very apropos, because on my list of videos, one of the videos I'm going to make of kind of the storytelling kind is maybe several videos, I'm going to talk about how, as a young child, because I didn't feel that love, I actually ran to the candy store. And I'm going to approach that topic from different angles, like why would they even allow a young kid to go into a candy store without their parents?
Mm,
That's another aspect of it.
right.
But I ran to candy and sweets, and it had a very detrimental effect. It pretty much ruined my dental health. These things do have consequences. But yeah, that was a very good point, that we often lead to these other behaviors that enslave us in other ways, because they make us dependent on things that we don't need to be dependent on, like going to the dentist, for example,
Mhm.
and other behaviors as well.
And that makes us more vulnerable to other forms of enslavement, right? Because we're enslaved in one aspect, and like you said, the fact that they'd let a kid go into a candy store sounds like people are permissing to some extent that type of slavery or that type of trauma, and they may not even realize it, or they may not look deeper into it and ask those questions, right? So that's where you mentioned before, it's like it's all still our consent. So let's talk about this now, mental illness and looking at the brain.
Yep. So thinking about what we just talked about on the previous slide and kind of synthesizing it. So the ego and the mind, the brain is going to act in these certain ways to protect us. And when it becomes chronic, this is actually mental illness. I mean, again, this is going to probably offend some people, but I'm just going to say it straight up. It's mental illness because it's an imbalance of the mind and also an imbalance of the brain. And what is happening is it is habitually bypassing higher order thinking, which is required for us to make good conscious free will choices, and then to inform our behaviors accordingly through informed consent and through our consent. It's bypassing that. It's always bringing it more and more to the lower level reactive mind, which is based on, you could say, almost more instinctive and programmed behaviors, because some of them are literally programmed into our mind, into our brain, to protect us, like we were talking about. So when those all exist, and it's not that that's good or bad. It's good that we have both higher order and lower order, because everything has a place in this reality. But when we're constantly shunting, the ego is constantly shunting control back to those the lower order consciousness, the lower order levels of types of thinking, that is basically a form of mental illness, because the mind is no longer in balance, and that's what allows these behaviors to perpetuate.
Mm, yeah, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit more then about how this brain works and why it is we suffer to these different extremes.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend people go and study uh, the work of others. I haven't necessarily done a video on this topic, although I may, um, to understand the different aspects of the mind and the brain, how they work, the two hemispheres, the higher brain versus the reptilian brain versus the mammalian brain, or what's sometimes called the limbic brain. It's really important to understand how these work, and it's not even, conceptually, it's not even that hard to understand if we would just pay more attention to it. But basically, the the higher brain, which is the human brain, that is responsible for reason and creating art and higher consciousness and understanding the world from a very, from a higher order level, that is constantly being over and over again subjugated, suppressed, bypassed, in favor that the lower brain aspects, which is both the limbic brain, which is responsible for the emotions principally, and also the reptilian brain, which is fight or flight and motor control, is and where the fear, where fear-based responses basically are emanating. So we have to understand that this is actually a physical phenomenon that's happening within our brain, that is interfacing with our consciousness, and that's another reason why these behaviors keep going over and over again. So we can see and understand why and how this can actually play out, then it can motivate us to take more action to actually do the healing that we need to do.
Yeah, and I would say looking at the differences between, the hemispheres and, and I know science people and science are gonna fight over different things, but just looking at the differences here, like just the basics of what constitutes the master versus the slave, or the left brain versus the right brain, just looking at what those contents can teach us really good lessons about paradoxes, polarities, extremes, right? So, let's take a look at that then, right? Master and slave, and how slavery is manifested by the imbalanced brain.
Yep. So again, to create this paradigm, this polarity of master and slave, we have two roles. And in some ways, they're kind of like poles, the opposite of the same. So it's all based on imbalance. It's all based on trauma. It's all based on program behaviors, but they kind of end up in two extremes. So the master mindset tends to be that left brain dominant, that very logical thinking. It tends to also dominate in the R complex, which again is that reptilian brain, that fight or flight, that instinctual brain. This manifests more as controlling behaviors. I need to be in control. I need to control the behavior of others in order to be safe, in order to be, who I need to be. And there is this chronic suppression of the empathy and the compassion, which would be required to remember, frankly, that others do have free will just like I do, and my role is not to control them. So we have to, the person who's this kind of imbalance, they literally have to lie to themselves and say that they have a right, or they're allowed to control others and basically take away their free will rights. So that is the master, and of course we could talk endlessly. It manifests as order followers. It manifests as the controllers, those who are kind of in higher positions of power in the current social paradigm. But it even manifests in the microcosm in family units as kind of like the dominating parent, often the father, not necessarily always, who's trying to control everybody else in the family. So it can manifest in different scales of reality, but it's always kind of that very left brain, divorced of emotion, divorced of any kind of empathy or compassion. And of course, this makes sense because the psychopaths who are often behind these, perpetuating these behaviors, they themselves are often from birth, not all of them, but many of them from birth are actually completely lacking that ability, right? And they're just trying to turn others to be like themselves, right? And then the slave is kind of the reflection of that. It's much more dominant in the right brain. It's therefore much more gullible and willing to believe things. It's the emotions that are dominant. It's actually thinking through emotions. You can see this everywhere in today's society. I've talked about the coaching industry, the new age religion, all religions to some degree. It's thinking with the emotions instead of thinking beyond the emotions. It tends to be more accepting and gullible, which one needs to be a slave. They need to accept their plight, right? Because violence is being inflicted on them in one degree or another, and they need to be accepted and not stand up for themselves in order to be a slave. It tends to be a suppression of the ego, the part of the ego that tends to defend oneself. In other words, the self-preservation. David Icke referred to it in his latest presentation as self-respect. Self-love is a term that Mark Passio and others have referred to it in their work. It's kind of like this knowing that I am, yes, I'm part of the whole, but I'm also a being that needs to take care of myself. So that needs to be suppressed to a very large degree for someone to actually agree to be a slave.
Right. It's like, should they succumb to their fate of being
Yep.
enslaved? No, I mean, they're not meant to be, right? They're meant to be free. They're meant to be more powerful. And by nature, right? They are the same as the master. So why should they be the slave? And what I see here with this dynamic that, when you're talking about this, what comes to mind is the master is sort of ignoring or disregarding the golden rule, and the
Yep.
slave is sort of just going along with it or has to consent to that.
Ignoring the self-defense rule. Yep.
Yeah,
So
right,
each of them is ignoring one of the two pillars of enlightenment. So the master tends to ignore the cause no harm aspect, and the slave tends to largely ignore the defend yourself against harm aspect.
right.
And that's
Good
why,
point.
again, this works like a paradigm, because both of those are part of objective morality, and they're both necessary.
It's kind of interesting, the correlation between the previous slide. I think it was three slides previous, and it was how the ego responds to trauma, and it reminds me of how the basically how the state, or the master, the all wise master that you know controls the entire life of the slave, and it blocks out memories of certain events. So you have like the state gaslighting or covering up certain events, or telling, spin. It's like how a narcissist would spin something, or how there's hardwires protective responses that bypass higher order thinking. So, they have all these systems in place that get you to not think about it, or it crafts a lie or a story to make sense of the events, and it's like the masters, the ego, run amok. It's like trying to respond to these traumas, I guess, that are being imposed. I don't know if that kind of I don't know if that makes sense really, but it's like all of these ways that our ego actually responds to trauma. It's like the state, parrots that and mimics that, and tries to, you know, hijack our subconscious to you know to get over, or it's like a synthetic, it's like a mask, like it crafts. I just think I keep reading crafts a story or a lie to make sense of the event, and that's totally not only what we do to cope with trauma, but unresolved trauma, but it's also exactly what our entire lives are, is a, a story that's been crafted by an ego, to try to make sense of it, so that way we don't really focus on the hard truth of it. I don't
Hmm.
I don't know if that kind of rings a bell with you guys, but
Yep. Again, it's the ego out of control. It's the God complex of the ego. Like, you literally have to think that you're likened to God or a God in order to inflict, to be in control, right? Especially, if we're talking about control of a large number of people. So that's the master mentality, and the slave mentality is again, it's just a reflection of that in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So now let's look at how we can get out of this. Your next slide says a fully conscious being knows that slavery is unnatural and can only exist with consent through specific behaviors. So right,
Yeah.
like the ones we talked about.
Yeah, so this is bringing consciousness, and this, of course, is what this presentation in part is about, or even just the entire process of becoming an initiate and learning this occult knowledge and understanding ourselves deeply. Because once you have that certain level of consciousness, like I can say with confidence that I know that slavery is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, and I know that the only way that I can be a slave is I'm consenting through my behaviors, right?
Hmm.
And then we can kind of look at how it plays out in the world. So the answer, as we're going to start to get into, is to bring more consciousness to it. That's really what I'm saying here, is the solution is to bring more consciousness to ourselves and to our behaviors, and therefore to the way we are co-creating this reality. Because once we do that, it is impossible that we would accept being in a state of slavery.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good points.
Yep. So the work here is twofold. Again, we all have prior traumas that need to be healed. We can't ignore them. We can't brush them under the carpet. We can't just forget about them. So we need to do that healing, even if it's an ongoing process, even if it takes us the rest of our lives to fully complete that work. And we need to take more proactive and preventative measures by, first of all, by sharing all the knowledge, by doing conferences like this one where we're talking about this to educate, and actually speaking out openly about what is happening systemically, the kind of induced trauma, the intentional trauma that's being perpetrated by these psychopaths. We need to speak about that very loudly and courageously and without hesitation, so that we can start to curtail that, so that everybody within their sphere of influence can actively defend, if necessary, their own children, children around them, other people around them, so that we start to put a stop to it. So we don't want to have to keep always be healing traumas if we can prevent them, so that it's always both aspects. That's why it's twofold, the work: healing traumas that have already happened, and also doing to what we can to the greatest degree possible to prevent ourselves from being traumatized and allowing these traumas to happen.
Right. Not just focusing on the treatment, but also on the prevention. Yeah, I totally agree. And looking at the root cause, like we said earlier, looking at the whole picture, looking at the
Yep.
individual. So it does start with ourselves, would you say? Does it start with ourselves?
It's always, the work is always starts with the inner world, because again, hermeticism, and once somebody starts diving into this, they see that through the principle of correspondence, they see, I mean, all the seven hermetic principles are important here, but in particular, the principle of correspondence informs us that whatever's going on in our inner world is going to reflect out into the outer world. We're going to reflect that out through our behavior. So we got to start inner work. You can't just go to the outer world. That's why people go out and start shouting on the streets about the ritualistic child abuse. Yes, we need to talk about that, and yes, we need to take action on that. But if that's all you do, and you still have this victim identity, you haven't done the inner work. You've got to do that shadow work. You've got to, there is no skipping that step if we want to truly live in a free world. And as Dr. Joe Dispenza said, I love his work. No matter, I don't necessarily agree with everything Dr. Joe Dispenza says, but he has some amazing body of work, and I think it can inform this work a lot. Is one of his best expressions that I really love is we need to learn to think greater than how we feel. We can't, which is another way, analogous way to say that in our circles has often been said, we need to not fall for emotional mind control. We need to not think only with our emotions. We need to be able to overcome. That's the only way you can overcome addictions, by the way. You can only overcome addictions when you think that behavior no longer serves me. And even though it gives me physical pleasure, or I expect it, or my body craves it, I'm not going to do it. That, and I was able to overcome many physical addictions through that way, by thinking greater than I feel. So this is extremely important, this ability.
Right. Yeah. And so the pathway to freedom.
Pathway to freedom based on what we talked about. Again, simple steps. You have to become a student of natural law and occult knowledge. It needs to become a lifetime study. You need to commit to that. It needs to be probably the most important study you do. It doesn't necessarily be the only thing that you do, but it has to be the most important aspect of your knowledge acquisition and your application in your life. You also have to, like we were saying many times here, discover, recognize, identify your own unhealed traumas, and then begin to take action to heal them, which entails deprogramming these often long-standing behaviors. Some, not necessarily always, but many times they have behaviors that we've been acting out most of our lives. And then once you have, necessarily going to finish all that, but once you've gotten further along on that path, like I have, then you can get out. Then you have the right to go out and start to teach others and replicate this knowledge and understanding like we're doing today, so that you and others can do the same thing. Because it's not going to be enough if just I know how to do that and I sit at home and do all that great work on myself, but then I'm not helping others to do the same thing. So this is the actual pathway to freedom. And I know you've talked about it, Corey, and using other terms like representation. We need to get out there. It's not enough just to know these things. That's the problem with occultism in general, is it's, even when someone knows and acts morally in their own life, they're still maintaining that knowledge. That's not going to work. If we want to be free, we need to share this knowledge loudly and proudly and broadly.
Right. Walk the talk too, right? Show it in action.
Exactly. And there's many different healing modalities. I've used many. People will find them. I think shadow work is something we all need to do. We need to understand deeply shadow work, which is really taking a good hard look at your behaviors, especially immoral behaviors or behaviors that don't serve, that are harming you and potentially harming others. Those are the ones that need the most attention. Anything that's dysfunctional, we've got to do that work. Again, that's probably going to be, something that happens over a lifetime rather than just, one and done. Journaling is something I do a lot of. It helps me a lot. I don't necessarily do as much as I did, say, a year ago or up till, not too long ago, because I had so much that I had to get out and so much I had to process, that journaling really helped me get a grasp on all of it. So even if you end up journaling only for a certain time, very valuable. Meditation, different types of meditation to bring more mindfulness, to be more present and not keep trying to escape the present moment. Corey, you talked about healthy diet and nutrition, exercise. Is part of the holistic approach. Like the mind body is the entire organism. Talk therapy can be a good thing if it's not the repetitive psychological loops that I talked about earlier. If it's like we're being honest within a small group and coming to grasp. This is kind of like a form of talk therapy in a way too, because we're talking through these things.
Right.
So talking group therapy and getting together with others is very important. Goes without saying, becoming a student of natural law, a lifetime student. Art and creativity, because as we talked about earlier, it's not just the science aspect, but we are essentially becoming artists. We are creating through art and through tapping into our imagination. So allowing that side of you to flourish, especially if you've been in the left brain dominance, is going to be very important. And then fasting, I actually just finished a 3.5 day water fast. And I'm not saying it's
Nice.
necessarily for everyone or everybody has to do it, but I can tell you, whenever I do it, and I haven't done it very often, it's extremely powerful and it's extremely healing. And I often get very deep insights into how to heal better that I wouldn't get otherwise. So that's
Mhm.
just another modality that people can tap into.
Right, right. Intermittent fasting and different types of fasting. Yeah, I mean, it could,
Yeah.
experimentation with these things could help too. I mean, at least you're doing something, right? And that's the key. And make yourself maybe some goals here and there, small, step by step. Doesn't have to be large goals. You don't have to turn your life 180 right away.
No.
Make it a gradual process. And if you have somebody that you talk to, right, or a health coach or a parent or a friend that you like to talk to and is willing to talk to you about certain things, and they maybe just ask you questions and get you thinking more about the situation. I think that's why journaling is also really useful. Thank you for
Yep.
sharing this, man. I really like your work, and I really like the fact that you do delve into most of these topics, and you're like, yeah, I haven't covered this topic yet. You'll cover it, I'm sure. You're covering everything. I love it, and I encourage people definitely check out your works because you do have videos on quite a lot of subjects, and you do make it really easy, and you break it down in a very professional way, as I said before. So, have you, when you, there's this belief system we call statism, right, which is this belief in government and in authority. And we talked about how, this kind of has to deal with mental slavery, where somebody feels like, oh, well, I need someone else in control of my life. I need them to take control of me and do these things, protect me, protect my rights and assets, or what have you. How did you escape statism? Was it through some of these healing modalities? Um, how long were you a statist, per se?
Well, I was a statist on and off, buying into that notion of authority for most of my life. It was about a year ago. It kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. When I watched Mark Passio's natural law seminar from almost 10 years ago, and I fortunately I feel like I've done a lot of healing work over the last 10 years myself to get my own mind and brain into a more balanced state already. So I think once the truth was, higher truths and deeper truths were presented to me, I was able to get them much more quickly than if I hadn't done all that pre work. The only thing I was missing was kind of like to put it all together, to synthesize it and say, yes, here is what's really going on.
Right.
Here is why statism is, basically accepting slavery, accepting the belief that people actually have the right to tell you what you can and cannot do, even when you're entirely right. So I needed someone to lay it out in a way that I could just grasp it all. And because I had done all that pre-work over the last 10 years, healing traumas to a large extent, healing addictions and other things, just being willing to work on myself, even if I hadn't figured it all out. That shift, when it happened, it was almost immediately. Like there was no going back. I was actually very angry at myself. That was the way I felt initially. I was very angry at myself for not having figured it out earlier. But I've forgiven myself since, because we all learn at the moment that we're ready to learn it. And obviously the work that we do together here is to accelerate that learning process for everyone. But I was able to grasp it, and since then, since about a year ago, I have been completely deprogrammed from any kind of status thinking. Even in the microcosm, when people try to be authoritarians in a small circle, I don't take it. I won't take that shit.
Yeah.
And I'll tell them right to their face,
Yeah.
you're not an authority. So, and I don't buy into any kind of authority, even in the microscopic realm. Even in, the only authority I buy into is that I'm an authority over my own self, my own mind, and I need to be, the monarch of my own internal psychology. That's the only kind of authority. But anything externally imposed, no, it's all
Yeah.
bullshit. And I'll call it out, even if it other people feel uncomfortable within my sphere of influence.
Right. And it's not like it's baseless. It's not like you're acting out of emotions purely and out of instinct. No, you know for a fact what is happening and who you are and what you're meant to be. And I think
Yep.
that is what makes all the difference, right? We're not just saying like disobey because we feel like it and because it's cool or whatever, We're saying there's a reason why, and it's it's part of the human destiny per se. You know, it's part of our evolution. It's part of our learning
Yep.
process. It's part of getting past these traumas. So thank you so much for sharing everything with the audience, and I'm glad to have you on this event. Is there anything else that you would like to share, or any final messages?
Yeah, I would say for people who are watching this, I'm probably guessing that people are largely in the sphere of either teaching this material, or they're still learning it and they're just kind of finding the courage to step up and do more. I would say just go deeper. Like, obviously you have free will. You're going to do what you truly desire. But, I would ask yourself, if you really want to live in a free world, get clear on that, and then start to share. And the beautiful thing about it is everybody can do it in their own unique way. And we don't have to all be copies of each other. We're all very different. So I want to encourage people to find that artistic and creative and unique approach to teaching this material. And even if it means teaching through theater, through dance, through film, I would love to see films. And there's so many different ways to share this important knowledge. So find what resonates with you, but just, you got to do it. This is the only way we're going to be free. And again, I'm going to assume that people are watching this, somewhere in their being they have a desire to be free. So I need you, Corey, and and Aaron, we need you to participate actively as well. It's not enough just to consume this knowledge. Yes,
Right.
consume it. Yes, apply it in your own life. Of course, that's very important. But please, you've got to, grow a pair. You've got to get out there. You've got to expose yourself. You may have to put your name in the public sphere. And in fact, you almost certainly will. Just do it. What I've started to discover, this will help people, is the more I get into this, and I'm sure you guys have experienced this, the more the universe is on your side. Because when you're on the side of good, when you're on the side of truth, you're gonna find, it's not even that you need protection, but you're gonna find the resources you need. They're gonna start to come to you. The opportunities are gonna start to come to you. This is the real law of attraction, right? The
Right.
real law of attraction is when you are acting rightly, what you need to keep going is going to come. So just go all in. I can tell you, I'm just getting started.
Right.
I'm just getting started. And I really appreciate, Corey, the feedback you've given my work. I really appreciate that a lot. I'd love to hear people's feedback. But I'm also saying, I'm just getting started. Like, you ain't seen
Yeah.
nothing yet. And
Yeah.
I want to encourage you guys to do the same thing.
Yes. Yes, I totally feel you, man. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
David.
Appreciate you guys a lot. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Appreciate you.
So if
Great
anyone
work,
else,
man. Great
yeah,
work.
if anyone wants to see your work, I just want to remind them, freedomvibe.art, freedomvibe.art, and your Freedom Vibe on other platforms as well. You can check
Yep.
it out. Your name is David Greenberg. For anybody who's curious, definitely recommend people check out your work. Like I said, topics, everything. Really good, really professional, really on point. And if anybody wants to see a lot more speakers like this and a lot of resources like this, go to nita.one/summit, nita.one/summit. This is the end of Slavery Summit. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.